Our first speaker this morning is Mr. Michael Moore. I've known and worked with Mike for many years, and his insight and focus on markets, domestic and global, for energy resources and commodities is highly respected. He specializes in CO2, enhanced oil recovery, and carbon capture and storage development. In addition, he's been involved in unconventional natural gas and oil developments for infrastructure, regulatory matters, policy, subsurface issues, and markets. Mike is the Vice President for Energy Commodities and Advisory Services for FearnOil, which is based in Houston, Texas, and a division of the Norwegian firm of Astrup Fearnley, based in Oslo. He also acts as the Executive Director of the North American Carbon Capture and Storage Association in Washington, D.C. It's a great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Mike Moore.
Figure this out. Sometimes I'm technically challenged. Good morning, and I'm honored to be the guy that gets us started in the morning, which means probably some of us would probably still be in bed. In fact, I would probably be typically one of those that's still in bed and not catch the first speaker, but I get the honor this morning. And Ken, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure working with you over the years, and folks at the Southern States Energy Board, and a few of you in the room that I've known for a number of years as well. I grew up in Kansas, spent a little time in New York City around the commodity side of the equation, ended up in Houston, and I've been down there since the early 90s. Puts me kind of in the heart of the energy world, and we get to watch a lot of stuff go on. I'm preaching to the choir when I throw a slide like that up there that talks about the impacts that unconventionals have had on the southern states. But what's really fascinating, it's not just that the southern states got a big benefit out of all this, but you're kind of really leading the pack. And 4 other parts of the country benefit from what goes on in the southeastern states, in addition to what you also experience on your own. And it's big, and it's huge, and it's not over. And it's been done with a lot of practical work and experience of all the industries, the regulators, and the politicians on the ground to move this stuff forward. The only thing we got to watch out for is what happens when the folks that got less experience with business and less experience with good policy and good regulations let their ideas run wild. So, we're worried about capturing CO2 on power plants and industrial facilities. I guess the guys in the milk industry got theirs coming now too. I look at that and I just shake my head going, who sits around and comes up with these ideas? I mean, I'm sure that somebody's thinking there's a lot of green jobs with this new idea. Think of what it would take and how many people it will take to hold a cow down and plug them in and bag him up. And then you got to unload it. So you captured that. What are you going to do with it? I guess put it in a... well, anyway, it doesn't matter what you do with it. It's just... I guess the point is there's just a lot of stuff. And so that's where the world of the practical business and practical politician and the practical regulator come into bear to make sure all this stuff works, so that you can have that happen. And it's a never-ending battle because, man, there's a lot of people out there that think that's pretty cool, and they pop up every day in all parts of the country, well, the world for that matter. So I'm gonna run through, and by the way, I got 25 minutes and about 100 slides, so if I talk really fast, you'll know why. Coal, CCUS, and CO2 EOR, knock that out. Unconventional oil and gas will be short pop. Changing U.S. power generation, again, preaching to the choir, so won't be too many slides there. What's going on with petchem and refining, infrastructure, and some things to go home and think about. So, coal. I get the chance to talk to people in a lot of other places than here, and I remind people that although there's this initiative to quit using coal in the U.S. by some factors, that is an incredibly valuable commodity to the people that own it. And they're going to go to great lengths to monetize that high energy density commodity that's ubiquitous around the world, and it's also very easily transported to places to get to and be utilized. So the people that own that, the states that have the land rights, the individuals, the companies, they may lose some of their markets to the utility sector, but they're going to find other ways to monetize that very valuable commodity. And don't discount where coal might go to find a market and what might be done to keep it in the market space. Coal utilization. Doesn't take a lot to follow the chain once you begin to gasify coal. It may not be the original pathway. It's maybe a little more expensive with all the issues on the regulatory side with CO2 issues. But if you take that pathway, there's a lot of things you can drive out of it, not just for power generation. And it all throws CO2. CO2, it's not a bad commodity. In fact, you know, there's a lot of things we can do with it to create value to help offset the cost of the utilization piece of the coal, which a lot of people in this room are very familiar with, or getting more familiar with all the time. This project in Mississippi, it's leading the charge on how to monetize something you can't transport very far. And lignite's very common around the globe, and it's very valuable to a lot of places that could put it to work. If you take this technology and put it to play, you give a lot of substance and value, power generation, valuable chemicals, and you also move the CO2 on out through that technology that's being developed out there, not being developed, it's being deployed at Kemper. Southern states, when it comes to CO2 EOR, carbon capture and storage, clean coal, Alabama Power Southern with its work at Plant Berry and the other projects with C-Carb is setting a stage for a lot of other people to follow the work that's been done. Mississippi Power in Southern Company with Kemper. Another important part is that National Carbon Capture Center and its partners with the DOE, where a lot of technologies are being tested that could lower the cost of capturing CO2 from a number of different processes, not just power generation. Southern States Energy Board with its regional partnership, C-Carb, its participation, the active response side of the projects that they've been part of with CO2, EOR, CO2 storage, technology development, all that, and the whole region of Southern States Energy Board is pretty critical. Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, Mike Smith is here. They've done a lot of work on the practical side of how you manage this with the state regulators. I've been involved in a couple of the committees that delivered some of the works, and that's the kind of work that sets the pace for the guys in Washington when they start countering, well, you got to do this, you got to do that, and IOGC comes back and says, well, we got the guys that are on the ground doing it. This is how you should do it, and we'll do it. DOE with its funding and its ability to fund the research to advance this. And then a lot of the states where there's active activities. By the way, Missouri should be on there as well as the rest of the other states. I didn't purposely leave anybody off the list at the bottom. Even Florida with its early work at Polk with gasification technologies has been an early leader in this space. So CO2 that's been captured has a lot of value in places I spend a lot of time. That's enhanced oil recovery. And the size of the value of the opportunity of CO2 for EOR is substantial. These numbers are down at the bottom row down here are in the billions. Texas has led the charge. It's been doing it for a long time. Typical CO2 EOR in a number of fields is pretty well understood. We've looked at it, rehashed it, and redug through it a number of different times. I'm very confident that there's a very large prize in terms of recoverable oil specifically used in CO2 in mature oil fields. Well, and we have new technologies, thanks to what's been going on with horizontal drilling and what have you, that's beginning to open our eyes to even better possibilities for more conventional production from mature fields. Well, we've got another area. It's called the Residual Oil Zone, which is the oil contact area underneath main pay zones, which there's a couple of areas where there's production taking place now. The only way you're going to produce is with CO2 in these areas. And that's the typical CO2 EOR operations in the United States. So residual oil zone, what we're discovering out there is that there's potential production not just under main pay zones where there's been typical traditional production ongoing with infrastructure, but those light blue areas are what we call greenfield fairways. And there's been a number, I think there's nine pilots that have been started or are going to run to prove up the veracity of producing oil where there's never been traditional production before because of these greenfield residual oil zones, or these fairways out in West Texas. And the numbers are staggering. There's going to be a report this fall that in 4-county area, Texas, that just in the greenfield fairway alone is about 100 billion barrels of original oil in place that's never had any production in it at all. The only catch is got to have CO2. So the asset's worth nothing unless you got CO2 for it. So basically, for all practical purposes, in the CO2 EOR community, we're tapped out on capacity for new supplies coming to the market. There's a couple of more naturally occurring sources, and so we've got a disconnect between what you capture and can sell, the cost is still high, and what you would pay as an EOR operator to get to that asset. And by the way, that asset has no value on your books either until you can prove you can contract the CO2 and bring the infrastructure to that field. But once you do, and that works, you've got proven producible reserves under certain accounting practices. We got something else that's on the horizon. This is a mind blower. Nobody quite knows what the size and scope of it is. So we go into typical shale production, and you produce, and those wells have a pretty steep production drop-off after about 18 to 24 months. And so the guys up at Continental Resources, Harold Hamm and his guys, asked the folks up at the Energy and Environment Research Center at the University of North Dakota to see if he could figure out a way to extend the resource capacity of these mineral rights he owned about 2.5, 3 years ago. And they looked at a lot of different things, and they decided, let's try CO2 down in these horizontal wells, and let's see what happens. And the initial response is they might be seeing another 3 to 8% recovery out of these wells that have already peaked off on their production curve using CO2. So think about the daily production in North Dakota and the Eagle Ford, which is pretty similar, that you could suddenly add another 3 to 8% production capacity if you had CO2. That's going on right now. It's not out there in the general domain to be commercially deployed, but it's something that has given that community a lot to think about. In the last 6 months, Kinder Morgan has put money into this program. Exxon with XTO has put money into this program. Marathon's in it. Hess is in it. I can go down the list. These guys, some of these companies are very capable of doing their own research if they thought there was something there. In this particular case, they're telling these guys. Why does that matter to the southern states? Well, it matters for 2 reasons. If they kick the production up there, where's all that oil going to go? It's coming this way. And if it works up there, it's going to work in the Eagle Ford. Again, so food for thought on the horizon. One last piece. When they began to put samples of the shale, and this is at the lab, it's in the lab, and the lab's a lot different than commercial practice. We all know that. But when they put CO2 into the shale in the lab, they can get as high as a 90% sweep out of that shale, of the oil in the rock. Typical EOR, maybe 30% when you put CO2 in the lab setting. I only put that out there as a thought, not an expectation. It's probably why people like Exxon have gotten their money behind this group up in North Dakota, because there's something to it. So Southeast, whatever happens up there, the southern states are going to ride the wave on that one. So again, preaching to the choir, we got one heck of a resource in this country, and it's showing its size and veracity. Some of these areas, like in California, haven't even begun to yield up what it might be capable of doing. Utica's just now beginning to deliver with high degree of confidence in these different areas it's producing from. Tuscaloosa Marine Shale, we're yet to figure out how that's going to play out, and who knows what else is yet to be out there to get deployed and played. So we got a lot of stuff to do for a number of years to come. And this is a fun one. We all know what's going on. You go back prior to 2008, and if you told anybody in the room that that's what our production curves are going to look like by 2014 in oil and gas, you'd have been met with a lot of skepticism that you could see a production curve that high, but you could build the infrastructure out fast enough and get the rigs on the ground quick enough and the service companies geared up fast enough to support that kind of production curve. But we did it. And it's not over. We don't know where it goes from here. Everybody's got a lot of estimates. One of the things that does happen is some of these areas have begun to tail off, but the area like the Marcellus and Eagleford and the on the gas, all the rest of U.S. shale are still expanding their capacity to produce on the gas side. So we're not sure where that goes, but it's not going to get smaller anytime soon. So the power generation, as a result of all this gas, and a result of regulations or the anticipation of them, we've seen fast re-estimations of how much generation is going to be online. Regulating the EPA side of the equation was, oh, you're going to lose a handful of plants. The industry says we're going to get shut all the way down. Study comes out in December, it says it's going to be only maybe 40 gigawatts shut down, and they reassess it a few months later, like about 3 months later, and they've increased it by another 25% on the amount of power plants getting shut down. This is some of the impacts that we're all seeing and feeling directly because of shale gas production and also regulations, but it also sets a chain of other things in motion. So got a lot of production for coal for that sector of power generation. It's not going to be consuming it. Something's going to happen to that end of it. And then just to reemphasize what we've been hearing about new generation, if you look at the bottom in the red circle, everything had new additions from a fuel resource standpoint in 2014 except for coal, 0. And that's probably going to be a trend for a while until something gets sorted out. Petchem and refining. So we've got a lot of oil production, a lot of associated liquids with gas production, and it's crazy quilt out there, but a lot of that stuff's flowing this direction. This is natural gas liquids. This is the stuff that's coming up in conjunction with the gas that you process away. And it's trying to figure out where to go to find a market. We got more than we know what to do with. And every day there's just a little bit more. In fact, it's getting so crazy in some sectors, we're thinking about using ethane for CO2 enhanced oil recovery for 2 reasons. One, it works. We believe it's going to, I think there's a pilot getting ready to run in West Texas. And secondly, it goes into the ground, it can come back up at the productions, and you can pull it off for a later date when it's worth more money. So all this gas is driving one heck of a new industrial renaissance. And this slide, the data in this slide is about a little over a year old, so the number of projects is actually higher. In fact, I think there'll probably be another couple of studies in the next month or two that'll take that up by another third. So that's the industry side that's being impacted by the gas production. And then we'll go into the petrochemical side and the amount of production that's going on there. Each one of these are core assets being built, but then you got the service industries, you got the labor pool, you got everything under the sun that supports every one of these projects. It gets kicked into gear, and it goes on and on and on, the ripple effect. That's how you got that 500,000 new bodies working as a result of the shale play in the southeast southern states. Crude oil and least condensate flow. It's a wave, and it's getting bigger, and it's trying to figure out how to get to a market. We got restrictions in the U.S. Things are changing. Pressure gets strong enough. People get antsy enough. Things will break loose and change. There's probably a certain amount of political capital in extracting value from those that want to try to export something. I think the administration's figured out that if you kind of equivocate on LNG and liquids and what have you, both parties come marching to their door with lots of goodies to try to get them to keep a position in play or to change it. So there's not a lot of incentive to accelerate anything at this juncture. So expect it to be clunky for a while. But at any rate, this kind of movement with this kind of commodity flow, and the arrows kind of denote kind of volumetric size. And I don't have the breakdown here, but you can certainly pull the study down and get the hard-working data. It's huge. And again, all this stuff has to be accommodated somehow. Infrastructure has to change. Labor pools and the service companies that get behind it. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger. It's kind of nutty. And you guys stand to benefit from most of it. Those 3 red circles pretty much encapsulate the primary refining capacity in the southern states. You guys kind of own it. If it doesn't get refined in the southern states, probably not going to, there's going to be some refining done, but you guys produce the lion's share of the transportation fuels that drive this country. Food for thought. Reutilization, a lot of stuff coming at us. The guys that own the refinery capacity going to great lengths to figure out how to use that product that's coming at them, and the guys that are producing it will get competitive because the barrels aren't worth much at the wellhead. They have to have a buyer. And crude oil by itself is not worth too much unless there's a refinery willing to convert it to transportation fuels and feedstock. So, and there's not as much capacity to haul it away as there is being produced. So what you have is a little bit of competition at the wellhead that I really don't care about my neighbor's barrels. I just want to get mine to the market because then I get paid. So you got discounts. Well, watch what happens on TV for the price, what the WTI might be doing on the New York Mercantile Exchange. But you go out to West Texas, same crude. It's just not in Cushing. Might have anywhere from a $5 to $15 barrel discount as the competition amongst the producers to get their barrels to a limited capacity market to get it to refiners. Those discounts are price signals for new infrastructure to get built, which is being built. So all that pressure starts pushing us into the world of exports. So there's no restrictions on refined products. So as much as you can crank through your refinery, depending on the quality of the crude you can burn and the kind of discounts you're getting from the producers and the kind of value you have in international markets will dictate how fast you take it to export. So we figured out how to kick our utilization rate to all-time highs, and it's hitting back up there. In 2012, we hit the all-time numbers for refined product exports, and it hasn't looked back since, because that's how these guys monetize the value of the refinery, and that's how the producers monetize the value of their crude is going out by exports. But then we also became a world-class LPG exporter, and we're about ready to become a world-class overnight ethane exporter. World's largest facility is going to get built in the Gulf Coast just to get this stuff out of the country and monetize it. And then just recently, we had the private letters on exporting condensate, which was lots of debate as just really what happened in that event. It's not crude oil, and as he had to do a few steps to get this process acknowledged. But the export package for the U.S. is big and huge. And by the way, most of those exports, the lion's share of it leaves from the southern states. We got the facilities down here, you got the refineries down here, the infrastructure comes this way, and the ships come this way to haul it back out. So you kind of hold the key to a lot of things. The southern states actually hold the keys to monetizing the commodity value for most of this new energy wealth that we found. In its raw form, it's got certain value. When you run it through and process into finished products or petrochemical feedstocks, the value adder kicks in, and that's happening down here, the transportation fuels. Infrastructure. So we got a lot of coal that's being backed up at the utility site. Again, like I said, the guys that own that resource are going to go to great lengths to find markets for their valuable commodity. So that's why we've got all this push to open up these coal export facilities. Some of them make sense, some of them have hit environmental walls, but the bottom line is, just like crude oil and just like ethane and LPG, the crude guys are working very hard, the coal guys are working very hard to find additional markets for their commodity, since we're not burning it here at home, but they're not going to leave it in the ground. It's too valuable. Where does U.S. coal go? We have lots of customers, by the way, for U.S. coal. It's not just Europe. Every one of those. And in fact, I was amazed by the number of countries that actually have bought our coal. This is back in 2012. And then kind of put in perspective on the lower right-hand corner the size of demand for coal around the world. And you look at where China was in 2012, and it just kept kind of on going. Now, they produce a lot of their own, but they kind of raised the bar as an importer of coal from other countries. So there's going to be a market for our coal out there if we can't monetize it ourselves. Gas storage. This goes back, not all those facilities are built. Lion's share of natural gas storage is where? Southern states. That means you guys modulate the gas supply to the rest of the country for the most part. Traditionally did most of it, in fact, except up in the Northeast. They'd probably do more gas storage if they could, but I think the environmental community is not real happy about putting anything in the ground in the northeastern states. So my guess is, as a rule of thumb, most of your large-scale gas storage will continue to be developed in the southern states and expanded in the southern states, because we know how to do it down here, and we have facilities and we have geology that's much more favorable than what you have back in the Northeast. There's a lot of pressure to do it in the Northeast because of proximity to Marcellus and the market centers, but I don't think that's going to be the case. Infrastructure changes. The flow patterns. The traditional pipe is the light-colored, kind of what do we call that, kind of a orangey, pinky, whatever, ruddy, brownish pink. Well, was the traditional flow of gas, and now you got all kinds of crazy flow for gas. We've got a lot of reverse lines that are now working from the Gulf Coast to the Northeast, are now reversing and bringing Marcellus gas to the Gulf Coast. Primarily, it's coming down for either firm industrial load that's being contracted now, or it's going for firm offtake for the LNG facilities that will process it for export. They're beginning to cut their contracts now so they can secure a long-term fixed gas supply. Pipeline projects, the infrastructure's changed in the last 4 years. Those are a lot of the major pipeline changes up till February. There's been a lot more since then. The price points between the discounts at the production zones to the market centers and the reversals of flow patterns are creating all kinds of changes in the natural gas infrastructure. And keep in mind, that's steel, that's labor, that's engineering, that's land use, that's regulatory permitting going, I mean, you name it under the sun. Every one of those are triggering a whole series of side events, 1 and 2 iterations away. Export terminals for LNG. I think this was back earlier this year. I think the number of projects that have got into the queue doesn't mean they're necessarily going to get approved for free trade or non-free trade agreement is about closer to 43 now, I believe. I don't know, Julio, if that's 41, 42. But it's like LNG import facilities. There was about 42, 44 that got in line to import, and we built about 6. Used 1 or 2 of them. Natgas export, don't forget, exporting natural gas out of the United States is not limited to LNG. We've got interconnections along the southern border and the northern border to move gas out of this country. And I'll tell you that out of Texas, there's a lot of work on expansions at these points where we cross into northern Mexico to move U.S. gas into the Mexican markets. And there's expansion on pipelines underway or being set in motion now. Myra, I don't know if you've seen much of that in Austin or not, or heard much about it, but it's unfolding out there as we sit here today, because the gas has got to find a market. Also, a lot of pressure to move gas is being flared in the Eagle Ford. Refining capacity in the southern states. I love this little, where's this thing got a little laser pointer on it? Yeah, I love this blue line right here. You know, that's Colonial Pipeline, and so the guys get all excited and noisy, and you know the environmental community really hates everything we do down here. But they also like to drive their cars, and it always amazes me that it's kind of like biting the hand that feeds you. You kind of go, we hate what you do, but I need my gasoline. And we don't like the way you make gasoline, but I got to have it. And you know, you kind of go, well, you know, we're all in this together, but somewhere there's got to be some common ground, because if you like to drive and you like the gasoline, you either build these facilities yourself, which you probably won't permit them to happen, or let us work it and do how we do our magic down here. And so, anyway, again, the southern states hold a lot of keys in this equation, however you choose to use them. And refineries, just like pipelines, just like natural gas, just like LNG, just like coal export facilities, lots of expansions and changes in the refining capacity. And this is 3 months old, a couple of months old. It's already dated. There's been more announcements on all the different expansions and changes to refining capacity, and most of it in the southeast, where most of it resides. And I'm not going to quote the numbers. I'll just say that they're all big, and they're getting bigger. These are actually, I think, refining capacities, expansion increases a little over 500,000 a day, and but there's more in the woodworks as more crude makes its way to them. Of course, if the option is to sell it to a refinery, and the refinery has the option to buy it rather than export it, he's going to line up at the door to get it before it goes out the door as raw crude. So crude oil pipelines, just like everything else, lots of changes going on, lots of expansions, lots of modifications. Gas lines are being reversed and hauling crude. You can't really do that with a crude line to haul gas, but you can change a crude line to haul liquids. So when all this spaghetti starts mixing and matching, a lot of things start moving out there. And I'm preaching a little bit to the members out here. You guys are seeing a lot of this firsthand. But when you start looking at the numbers and you realize the billions of dollars that are moving around on the raw materials, in the labor pool, on the hard assets at either side of these pipes and systems, and how fast that we did this. If you said we were going to mobilize these resources with these returns in less than 10 years, who would have believed us? I mean, we've done something that actually hasn't been mimicked anywhere else in the world at this point. I don't think it will get mimicked anywhere else in the world to the point we've done it for a lot of reasons. So if you can't get it moved by pipe and you can't build the pipe fast enough, what do? You stick it in a rail car. Putting up rail terminals all over the place. Just in the U.S. Gulf Coast alone, there's now 24 plus rail terminals for bringing crude down in lieu of a pipeline coming as far north as Canada. Alberta's got crude coming down by by rail car. We've got crude in the Bakken that's going to Canada, up on the northeastern seaboard, down to Philadelphia, to the refiners in that area, all the way out to the West Coast in California, and coming all the way down to the Gulf Coast. Eagle Ford crude's going the opposite direction. We see some Eagle Ford crude going all the way up to the refineries up in Newfoundland. It's nuts, but it's a lot easier to move a tank car around than it is by a car. But look at the growth of tank car capacity in the U.S. 2009, 2008, just around 10,000 tank cars, not trains, tank cars per year. We'll break 500,000 tank cars moving crude oil in 2014. We used to laugh at the Russians for being inefficient with the way they moved their crude oil out of the Siberia production areas because they could have just built the pipe. And now we're doing what the Russians do because we can't build pipe quick enough, we can't get it permitted quick enough. Panama Canal. So we got a lot of exports. I don't think we're going to have any problem using the Panama Canal as it gets done. So it opens the door for transportation fuels, natural gas liquids, coal exports, LNG exports, the whole world. Helps open the door and open those markets for which markets? Markets out of the southern states. Some things to think about. In the wintertime, with all this gas, all this infrastructure, and a flat demand on power generation, the load's been fairly flat in most parts of the country, and a very, very robust natural gas storage capacity for this country, we still just about hit the dead zone back earlier this fall, this spring when we were hit with that cold wintertime. We got hit with that cold weather. We got under a TCF of working gas in all of our storage facilities across the whole country. You're getting to a point where you start hitting the cushion gas in some of these facilities to fulfill supply obligations to your contracted store or gas holders. The system at that kind of level is running at negative. You're not negative pressure in your storage facility, but you're well under your original reservoir operating pressure. And you pull that much harder, you can start doing damage to the pore space, storage capacity, and the oil and gas, the old converted oil and gas reservoirs for future use. And I know that everybody's excited that we've had some good fill days, but we're going into next season, we're going to be 25% under last year's capacity, which just about took us into rolling blackouts. In some cases, another 4 days, 5 days of the demand that we saw down here would have shut us down on gas-driven generation. We were at a place nobody thought we were ever going to see. And guess what? We had flat load. I mean, the industry as a whole was experiencing flat load. So new builds to come online aren't really in the works in case we ever get a little economic bounce and we see power load increase. This starts getting kind of problematic. Now, I don't have a solution. I'm just telling you, keep an eye on it. If we get another cold winter, this gets interesting. We have a market. So when markets start kicking in, and you start running short of commodity, may the best bidder win. That's why Texas has raised the cap on its power markets in the summertime. I don't know where we go to next summer. It's like $9,000 a megawatt. Just market stuff. So gas and oil that's driving this wonderful event that we're going through all have two things in common. They got a very rapid decline curve on all these wells. This is all, by the way, all this information I've got is pulled out of public domain studies and documents. There's nothing here that I put together as a proprietary thing. And then most of it's reference where you can pull these studies and articles down. So keep in mind that every 18 to 24 months there's a wave of wells that made press when they came on stream that are going off at these kind of production rates. We're talking 70, 80, 90% decline in production in a very, very short period of time. So we have a production curve that runs like this with wells that have a drop like that. anything changes in the ability to drill wells to offset the ones that we lose, or anything that changes our ability to continue to add wells so that we keep the production curve growing, could have some very interesting impacts on gas supply and crude supply in the country where the assets are right now adjusting to this long-term new supply scenario. So changes in capital, taxes, incentives could change how fast these wells are re-drilled to offset the decline curve. Changes in regulatory permitting for new wells to be drilled in areas that we're moving into, or re-entering old wells for new work could change how fast you could replenish those well production curve drops. So the regulations, policy, things that happen at a state level, federal level, could have some very disastrous unintended consequences if you slow down the drilling programs in any one of these regions. And it's something to think about. And then a couple things to kind of toss in the middle of things. In 2012, the impacts of all our good stuff in the U.S. Also gave us lower gas prices. Our lower gas prices gave us lower power prices. Our lower power prices created a great place for a lot of German industries to start running into the U.S. We create a lot of economic tension with some of our NATO buddies and European buddies because we were taking their businesses and they're moving them over here. So that was in 2012. They hadn't stopped. 2012, our coal has to find a home. Sold it to Germany. Germany shut down almost all of its new natural gas plants. Some of these plants had only been operating for 24 months because the gas was too expensive. Our coal was really cheap. And so what happened? Germany's telling us how we should be doing all this renewable stuff and lowering our greenhouse gas emissions while they're buying our coal, and their greenhouse gas emissions are going higher. You gotta love markets. And then was one last piece here. The administration raises the price on carbon. Social costs of carbon changes how the value and the impacts of anything tied to CO2 is given a dollar value for regulatory reasons. So if the EPA says if we limit this much CO2 to go into this region, and we've offset by these dollar values of dollars per tons of carbon, this is the economic benefit that we've impacted and driven home for you. And then in California, while the East Coast was running out of gas, California was bone dry at one point. There was no gas in the system in California to supply generation if they needed it. And they were screaming and yelling that we're doing it all wrong and that we're environmentally wrong in how we've done our things. At the same time, they ran out of gas. You didn't hear much about it because what was going on in the East Coast was overshadowing what was going on in California. And then in January and February, both, we ran short in the New England area, New York City, Citygate, I want to say Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Boston. In some cases, gas was about $5 and change. At Henry Hub in the Gulf Coast was $140 per MMBtu for that same gas in that market sector. Just markets working. Anyway, shale, something to think about. What we learned how to do here, we can take it all over the world if the world opens up. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And then don't discount what's going on with the carbon stuff. They've circled the wagons. May not like what's going on out there, may not like some of the people that are doing it, but we have a lot of multinational companies that operate in the U.S. that are operating in a lot of these countries. So they've gotten very comfortable with this notion of working in carbon managed markets. So they won't go away.
Thank you, sir. Michael, you spoke a lot about exports. Would you address this issue that we have addressed several times about energy independence in North America? How soon you think that will occur, and what role natural gas in particular and coal will play?
Well, that's a $64,000 question, and I'm not a politician, so I don't have to worry about stirring up either side of the table. Well, we've always had enough coal to do a lot of things with, but our environmental relationships to coal have made that very tough to utilize. As we have a certain amount of energy independence at our fingertips if we're allowed to exercise it. So maybe it's not so much the issue of the exports as it is the ability to be allowed to use this resource in a way that gives us that independence. You know, sometimes I'm not so sure that some people are very happy to keep us hooked on somebody else's program so we can ship our money out of this country. And sometimes it shows up in the form of regulations that make it very hard for us to use our own stuff. You know, there's a lot of countries that feed off us buying their goods and services. They're not in a big hurry to see us change that. In fact, we move so fast on shale oil and shale gas that I think people are just now figuring out that it's going to be here for a while. They kind of discounted it, thought it was American BS, and it's here for real. We're on a track, and I don't know, into the issue of exports, I'm a free market person on one side, but I'm also a firm believer of if you can figure out a way to keep your dollars cycling local instead of moving them out and never have them come back in, I'd certainly be more willing to see that work first. And there's lots of hair on that export stuff as well. And there's lots of nuances of what it is you're trying to export. We're exporting a lot of crude every day. It's just going out as gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel and unfinished transportation feedstock. I mean, a lot. So we're kind of there. It's just a function of how you want to paint that picture. And there's no restriction on that. It's just how much money you want to spend on the refining asset to convert it to something that's exportable.
Representative Watson.
Yes, I'm from Oklahoma, and seen a lot of boom times.
Yep.
And historically, rail always comes in first, and we've seen that historically. I would be interested in your observation. You addressed some of this earlier, but I am kind of curious. You know, we do have pipelines haven't stopped. I mean, we did that southern leg from Cushing down to the Gulf. But I'm just curious. You know, we have a lot of noise now about rail. Do you see that dynamic changing, and maybe see less pipelines, more rail in the future, or do you have a thought about that? Just kind of curious what your thought is about how we're going to move oil in the future, and you know, if in fact this is just kind of the first blush, it's always rail, and then we eventually move to pipe.
Well, if you can change the duration of the production capacity of these wells after they start producing, so a guy that has an area with a lot of production knows that he's going to be at peak production for a few years rather than 18 to 24 months, then you might change how you can figure out where these pipes go. You're going to get pipes to general areas, but as these wells tail off, the gathering capacity, the mid-level marketers, how much are they going to invest in hard assets in the ground when the region that they've just plugged into is out of production in 18 months? Or more importantly, if you're the pipeline operator and the guys you're talking to as they're moving through a region and their wells are coming up and going down, he's not going to get a 10-year, 20-year firm commitment as we traditionally have seen in the past. He's going to get a firm commitment for transport for 36 months. And if you look at a lot of these pipeline deals, you'll read in there and follow that some of the shippers have had a hard time getting the firm transport commitments from the shippers because they don't know what region is going to stay hot for how long. And each producer, he's not the region, he's got his own little carve out. And when he's done producing one area, he moves on to the next one and keeps drilling. So I think that's why rail has a role to play for some time to come. I don't think this changes anytime soon. The number of wells we drill can increase, but we got a lot of rigs working right now, which takes a lot of crews, which takes a lot of service, and we'll see how that goes. But I think that's probably your biggest. Now the long haul pipes, they can hit areas, and they're getting built because at that point in time you've got the bulk capacity that needs to be shipped. But the regional stuff where the rail cars can move into, and terminals are pretty simple. I mean, it's a couple of arcs, a track, and some surface rights, and maybe the hardest issue might be the landowner rather than the permit. Anyway.
Let's thank Mike Moore very much.
Thank you.